I'd like to thank Proven for sponsoring this video. Do you have a problem with your 1/4 inch seam? Are your blocks wonky or out of square? And what is a scant 1/4 inch anyways? In today's quilting tutorial, we are diving in to one of the most important skills in quilting, mastering your 1/4 inch seam. How to find it, how to make it, and when and why it's important. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And if you like what you see, please click that subscribe button. If you are brand new to sewing, a seam allowance is simply the distance between your seam and the edge of your fabric. And over time, the term a 1/4 inch seam allowance has just been abbreviated to a 1/4 inch seam. In quilting, we use a 1/4 inch as the standard. In upholstery, they use a 1/2 inch. And in garment making, they use 5/8 or a 1/2 inch depending on the maker. You may have asked yourself, why do quilters use a 1/4 inch seam?
So go back 150 years ago when quilting cotton became affordable.
And people started making quilt tops with their scraps. They would use templates to mark the sew lines and cut out the fabric by hand. The seams didn't need to be large because you weren't making any alterations like clothing. Plus, as they hand quilted, the fewer layers that the needle and thread had to pass through, the easier it was to manage. Then, as block patterns began to be circulated in magazines and newspapers, and with the arrival of the sewing machine, a standard seam allowance was needed. Instead of tracing templates, they now used the edge of the block and measured in, and the 1/4 inch became the standard. If you're like me and came from garment sewing, sewing that 1/4 inch seam is harder than shifting your fabric to the left. First, you need to know where the 1/4 inch mark is on your machine. Most modern machines have the 1/4 inch marked on the stitch plate, but some of the older ones, like this one, does not.
So you'll need to take a gauge like this one, or this one, or this one, and locate it. On this machine, it's just at the edge of the feed dogs. There's not a lot of fabric in a 1/4 inch, which makes it hard for the right side of the presser foot and feed dogs to engage with the fabric, which will make a natural tendency with your machine to pull to the left.
So on this machine, I solved the issue by moving my needle over a click and making a ledge of painter's tape.
This puts a little bit more fabric underneath the foot and gives me the results I want.
Now on my new Bernina, this is much, much easier. I have marks on the stitch plate, I have marks on the sewing table. This is a 1/4 inch foot, and this is a 1/4 inch foot with a guide.
I use painter's tape here too, because it helps me sew straight.
I use 4 to 5 layers and place it along the 1/4 inch mark and butt my block up against it. I have more pointers on how to sew straight in this video because a seam has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you sewed exactly on the 1/4 inch mark, but your finished blocks are small. How did that happen? Now, there's 2 main reasons for this. A beginner mistake is not pressing your seams properly. Maybe you do something like this. Maybe you get a little swish going too. Though swishing feels like it's doing the job, take a look at how much fabric is left in the fold. And the block is also no longer square. Learning to press my fabrics well and not swish led to the single biggest improvement in my results. First, you set the seam, roll the fabric over, and then finger press. Then use a hot iron and press. I often let go of the iron so I don't swish, and I don't use steam. Look at the difference in the results. Now, I have already made a video about this technique, and for a fuller explanation, you can check that out. The second mistake that quilters often make is not measuring the 1/4 inch from the right spot. You might think that we measure it here, from the back of the fabrics, but that is just the starting point.
We need to measure it from here on the front.
So take 3 strips of fabric of the same width, sew them together, then press open with a good ironing technique. Then measure the distance between the seams. Then move your guide accordingly. Personally, I occasionally get it right on the first try, but normally it takes me 2 or 3 tries, and sometimes 4 or 5.
This is an important step that you should do every time you start or switch projects.
Because as we roll these pieces open, this fold takes up space. How much space depends on the thickness of the fabric and the threads in the seam. So I sewed these 2 pieces of fabric using the exact same marks on my sewing machine, and this one is bang on, but you can see this one is just slightly smaller. It's just got a little bit of white there.
Which can be the difference between your blocks coming out perfect or coming out small.
Before we go to the next question, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Proven. I have struggled with skincare my whole life. I have sensitive combination skin, and every time I have tried to set up a skincare routine, in a matter of days my skin would flare up. So when I was approached by Proven to take the skincare genome quiz, I was skeptical to say the least. But I did answer it honestly, my biggest concerns being discoloration and redness. I answered questions about my skin, lifestyle, and my physical location, and based on my answers, I could see how they personalized the ingredients for my needs and concerns. And a week later, I received a custom kit formulated just for me. So I started using it daily. Moisturizer in the morning with a cleanser and nighttime moisturizer at night. And 5 weeks later, I cannot believe how nice my skin is. And so many viewers have even commented on it. It's so much smoother, the leatheriness around my chin is almost gone, and the redness is significantly less. The quiz nailed exactly what I needed. And from those easy steps, I was able to seamlessly incorporate them into my morning and evening routine. If you would like to give Proven a try, click on the link in my description box and use my code QUILTS99 to get your first personalized Proven system for a limited time at only $99. It's a 50% discount off the regular retail price. A scant 1/4 inch seam is just inside the measure for the regular 1/4 inch seam. So it's a couple of threads smaller. Some quilters just prefer not to make a tester piece and use a scant 1/4 inch all the time. It's a shortcut that will deliver good results most of the time.
Like when your blocks are assembled in a simple grid, or when your blocks have the same number of seams in both directions.
There are many techniques where a 1/4 inch seam is just not important. In paper piecing, you have lines to sew on. So if you trim it a little bit bigger or it's slightly wonky, it's not going to matter. When you sew 2 or 8 at a time,
Half square triangles,
or the 1 or 4 at a time flying geese, you are sewing on a marked line. Then your cuts are just separating the pieces. So again, the 1/4 inch seam here doesn't matter. In snowballed corners, you're also sewing on the line. How you cut the seam allowance doesn't affect the size of the block.
the seams on the back of the quilt. It's more important that it is a straight seam than the width of it. It can be anywhere from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And finally, you do not need to be accurate when you're making improv blocks. You might be thinking, duh, Karen, obviously you don't need to be accurate here, but they are also a great activity after you've had to be precise.
There are times where you do need to be very accurate. Sampler blocks run from the simple to challenging to simply diabolical. And to make it all fit and your points line up takes accuracy in your 1/4 inch seam. Compound blocks are blocks that are made up of other blocks. And those blocks can also be made up of other blocks. And that can also mean different shapes of blocks. And if your seam allowance is not accurate, they're not going to end up the size that you need to fit them all together. In general, the larger the block, the more forgiving they are. And the reverse of that is also true. The smaller the pieces, the less forgiving they are.
When you're sewing at this small scale, there is no wiggle room. Thread widths matter. And an accurate 1/4 inch seam was how it all came together.
There are plenty of tools out there to help you with your 1/4-inch seam. First, there are patchwork presser feet. This foot is a 1/4-inch wide. This one has a notch at the 1/4-inch. Some might even have a guide. There are ledges that you can buy to help set the 1/4-inch and to help you sew straight. This one came with my presser foot. There are plexiglass rulers that you can stick on. And my personal favorite is just making a ledge out of masking tape. I like that the masking tape is also multi-purpose, and I can use it on all of my machines. There is marking tape that not only helps you with your 1/4-inch seam, also helps you with the center line when you're making HSTs. There are gauges to help you measure the seam allowance from your needle.
There are 1/4-inch clips with markings that you can align with the marks on your sewing machine.
And there are paper piece patterns so that you don't need to worry about the seam allowance at all. Just follow the lines. A 1/4 of an inch is a 1/4 of an inch, which you can sew on any machine. When quilters say that it's different on different machines, what they're really meaning is the reference points on each machine gives different results. If you test, measure, and adjust, like I've outlined before, you can achieve a perfect 1/4 inch on any machine. Sewing a 1/4 inch seam takes skill, and like all skills, it takes time to master them. Make it a habit to do a practice block before you start. You can do it by making bonus blocks out of your scraps. And if you miss the mark, you don't need to worry. You get to adjust and try again. You will find as you practice and experiment with different quilting techniques that the tools you use will change. And as your skills improve, you won't need that latest and greatest gauge anymore because you'll already know what works for you. Come join me on my next cruise to Iceland. In June 2024, we will board the new celebrity ship Apex in Southampton for an 11-night voyage to Ireland, Iceland, and Scotland. We will see glacial lagoons, volcanoes, and black sand beaches. While at sea, you can join me and Kate Matthews for some Bernina sewing classes. I can hardly wait. This one has been on my bucket list. If you would like more information on this cruise, just go to my website, Just Get It Done Quilts,
and request a brochure.
If you found this quilting tutorial helpful, check out my tips and tricks playlist. Take care, and I'll see you next time.